Hello, I'm Diana Reich, the Artistic Director of the Charleston Literary Festival based in South Carolina, USA. I would like to welcome you from wherever in the world that you may be watching. If the past fraught 18 months has taught us anything, it has taught us that books and their authors, whether classical or contemporary, really matter. In trying times, readers turn to books for insights into the human condition, for the opportunity to be transported to other worlds, for ideas, for arguments, for inspiration, for experiencing the impossible, for laughter, and for the release of tears. The festival will provide the opportunity to engage with a galaxy of literary and artistic stars, as well as up-and-coming writers who are making waves. We have a far-flung cast list featuring authors from all over the United States, as well as the United Kingdom and elsewhere. Whether they're talking about former literary trailblazers, or gene editing, or human rights, or popular culture, or feminism, or medieval nuns, or innumerable other subjects, they have one thing in common: the ability of compelling stories to linger in our imaginations. We're grateful to all our speakers, whether virtual or in person, for sharing their talents. Please thank them by purchasing their books. The festival couldn't happen without a committed team and board. We would like to thank our donors, both private and public, who generously make the festival possible. The College of Charleston, our academic partner, has been an invaluable source of support. It's no accident that the festival takes place in Charleston, a prime destination with a progressive literary and artistic tradition. Please come and see for yourselves, but make sure to visit during the Charleston Literary Festival, which takes place during the first half of November each year. Meanwhile, I hope that you enjoy the 2021 Charleston Literary Festival and that it makes you think and dream afresh. I'm delighted to introduce the novelist, Alison MacLeod, who will be talking to Bill Goldstein about their mutual interest in the 20th century English author and controversialist D.H. Lawrence. Alison MacLeod is the author of 3 novels, The Changeling, The Wave Theory of Angels, and Unexploded, which was longlisted for the Booker Prize for Fiction 2013, as well as 2 collections of stories. She's also visiting professor of English and creative writing at the University of Chichester. Alison was raised in the States and Canada and lives in the UK. Her new novel, Tenderness, is a fictionalized evocation of D.H. Lawrence's last years, including the writing of Lady Chatterley's Lover and the subsequent trials for obscenity in America and England. Bill Goldstein is editor of the New York Times Books website and book critic for the weekend edition of WNBC's Today New York. He's also the author of the non-fiction book, The World Broke in Two, which features D.H. Lawrence, among other writers. It's my pleasure to hand over to Bill Goldstein and Alison MacLeod.
Well, thank you very much, Diana, for that introduction and for inviting me to interview Alison and also to participate in the Charleston Festival virtually. I have enjoyed being there live in person and hope to do that again in the future. But here I am in New York with Alison. I positioned myself specifically so that I would have all my D.H. Lawrence books behind me. I'm not sure that the people out there will recognize the spines in the way you and I do from having used those books in our work. But I'm surrounded by Lawrence, and also, as we discussed, I also have my father's copy of the Grove Press edition of Lady Chatterley's Lover from 1959.
Yes, mine is one of my very fondest pieces of my Lawrence collection, that Grove Press 1959, and to imagine it actually being carried about by a particular character in my novel was a real pleasure. Thank you, Bill.
No, thank you, and I'm glad we're at least meeting this way. As I think, we discussed, we were once on a radio program this summer together, but we of course didn't see each other. So we were speaking
we
too
are.
much, but here we finally get to meet virtually. So before we go too much farther, I think we should say a little bit about what your novel is and why I was showing my father's edition of Lady Chatterley's Lover. So why don't we begin with the title? Like, tell us about it, why it is such an important word, and why it is the title of your novel, and then we'll get into what your novel is actually about.
Absolutely. Thanks, Bill. It's a lovely way in. So my novel, entitled Tenderness, takes its title from a working title that D.H. Lawrence had for Lady Chatterley's Lover. As he was writing it, he wrote to an artist friend called Dorothy Brett and said, I think I may rechristen the novel Tenderness. And for Lawrence, Chris, if we go back, and perhaps I'll just say a little bit about his novel for anyone who might not be acquainted with it. So Lady Chatterley's Lover, many of us know the name, many of us know the figure of Lady Chatterley, perhaps like we do Sherlock Holmes or Alice in Wonderland or that sort of, so she's out there in culture. But the novel itself, yes, it was a scandalous novel when it was first published privately by D.H. Lawrence in 1928. He had to publish it privately because his publisher deemed it too hot to handle. And the main reason being it was for the day, not for now, but for the day, it was sexually explicit. And that now, in some aspects, looks a little bit dated. But what remains radical is the way in which he narrates a love story with a whole philosophy behind it. And his notion of tenderness was a sense of a kind of honesty about how we live as human beings, from the sexual to the spiritual to the natural world to the political. It was all related in Lawrence's universe. And for him, this word tenderness was, of course, about compassion at the social level. It was about the connection of human bodies, body to body. And even today, where I would say his work still looks fresh, is the attention he gives to the kind of honest expression of the human body. It is still daring, actually. That amazed me when I went back rereading how fresh and daring it is. But tenderness isn't only a kind of sentimental notion in Lawrence. Tenderness is about that compassionate touch and understanding between human beings, between couples, and then more widely socially. But it's also about coming through human vulnerabilities, coming through human fallibilities, coming through darker impulses that are all part of the human experience, the human sexual experience. So for him, it wasn't too cozy an idea. It was a kind of loving connection, but once one had come through. And that's where the daring edge of Chatterley is.
I love that you say coming through, because one of Lawrence's books of poetry is called Look, We've Come Through.
Come through.
So there's just
yes, actually. Yeah, that's a beautiful insight.
Passage, that tenderness provides the connection. And then through experience. Tenderness is an experience in and of itself, but is in many ways a way through. That it helps through. And Lawrence,
yes, and I think Oliver Mellors, the gamekeeper and the sort of illicit hero of Lady Chatterley's of the novel. Mellors says, "I stand for the touch of human connection. I stand for the touch of human awareness." So, I stand for human tenderness. I'm misquoting slightly, but he stands for human touch, human connection, human awareness, and they're all wrapped up in body to body connection between human beings.
Well, so tell me a bit, and tell the audience, how you first became interested in Lady Chatterley's Lover, and what made you think that there was a novel to be written about the novel Lady Chatterley's Lover. Because it's not only about the novel, but then the novel's afterlife. So we'll actually get into that.
Thank you, Bill. Yeah, it's traveling back to about 2015 when I knew I had a novel on my hands. And I had, as a teenager, I had loved Lady Chatterley. I think I went to it for a bit of sex education, as many did of my age, and probably didn't really find it, if I'm honest. But what I did find, and I remember it was my first real experience as a teenager of being profoundly moved by two characters. That surprised me. So there was that. It was a very memorable read from my teens. But that in itself wouldn't have been a reason for me to go back to it as a writer now. Instead, what I discovered was something that really astonished me. And it was a telegram. In fact, I've got a little copy of it here. It's very brief. And it was sent by the FBI to its Chicago field office. So it was sent from Washington HQ to the Washington field office in 1959. And it was about that very book you just held up, that copy of the Grove Press. And Barney Rossett, the publisher of Grove Press in 1959, actually even before the very famous English publication, Barney Rossett was on the case in New York and was determined to bring back the full original illicit Lawrence script. The FBI had long been tracking Barney Rossett. They had a huge dossier on Barney Rossett because they thought he was publishing un-American titles. They thought he was publishing iconoclasts. The FBI, when I came across this little telegram, I thought, oh my gosh. And this is it. It would be desirable to have a copy of this book that was published by Grove Press by Barney Rossett. In the event this book can be, in the event, only if, this book can be discreetly obtained without disclosing the Bureau's interest in this highly controversial book. And I thought, oh my goodness, here we are, 1959, in the midst of the Cold War, and the FBI is following Grove Press, yes, but particularly trying to get Grove Press through Lady Chatterley's lover. They're trying to dismantle Grove Press or bring Grove Press down. So that set off all sorts of wheels in motion. And I thought, I then thought I want to be able to convey to the reader the history of this novel from 1928, the creation of it, to the banning of it, and then most interestingly for me, the latter part of the 20th century, still trying to control the fate of this book, to suppress it, but with wider that's the wider American political context, and the way that very activity connected to the same time all sorts of covert activities going on by the FBI and being monitored, being very dark strategies, as we all know at the FBI at this time, and the way those two worlds might link up.
So there are a lot of what ifs. I mean, so tell us about sort of the what ifs that you began to think through once you came across this telegram. Obviously, it was a telegram to your imagination too, not only from Hoover to the Chicago field office, but to your imagination over in Brighton.
Yeah,
I believe. Right.
That's right. So so I then began to dig. I requested, through Freedom of Information, more FBI files on the subject. I spoke to FBI experts and to really get the kind of working methods of the time and to get as close in on that as I could. So, and meanwhile, on the British side, there were huge reams of literary detective work going on as well. But the what if that for me was pivotal, and is perhaps pivotal for the story itself, was I thought, right, we've got J. Edgar Hoover pursuing this book covertly for various means to various ends that sort of widen and widen as 1959 and 1960 roll on. But then I thought, I can't just go from D.H. Lawrence writing to J. Edgar Hoover. That would be absolute madness. So I need a bridging figure. I need somebody in the States to help me open up and reveal and to connect this world of creation with the world of suppression that Hoover represents. And I thought, who else in 1959, 1960 might have taken an interest in Lady Chatterley and what was happening to that book with Grove Press and the hearing and the controversy? Who else might have been following that controversy? And a hunch came to me one day. In fact, I think I might have been over at Charleston, the sister festival, when I was walking about. And I think I remember being in a certain tent at that festival and thinking, what about Jackie Kennedy? And Jackie Kennedy. And I thought, I have a hunch, Jackie Kennedy. One, she was hugely illiterate, as we know. She was a dedicated reader from the time she was young. She had been a reporter before she was married. She'd covered the coronation in England and for the Washington Herald Tribune. So she'd had a column. We know she went on to become an editor. The Kennedys themselves were perhaps the most literary couple, most literate couple ever to be in the White House. So I thought, that stayed with me. I then discovered, and to condense, I discovered that in 1962, April 1962, about 18 months after the famous obscenity trial in London, Jackie Kennedy, more or less buttonholed at a state function, the critic Lionel Trilling, got him up to a private party, ignored the rest of her sort of 6 or 8 guests, sat down for an hour and a half and said to Lionel Trilling she just wanted to talk about D.H. Lawrence's novels. And I thought, there, my hunch was onto something. So in this novel, What If, I imagined we've got the book that you held up. It's just been released. The FBI's got evidence of it going through the US mails. At that time, it was considered obscenity. It still was obscenity in 1959. It was being shipped through the US mails. That shipping brought Barney Rossett into danger and Grove Press into danger. They confiscated copies all over the States. They impounded them. They were locked away in sort of vice squad locker rooms, and a hearing took place at the GPO in New York. And I thought, it's May 14th, 1959. What if Jackie Kennedy walked in and took a seat at the back of the public gallery? So no one knows he was in the public gallery that day, but there was quite a busy public gallery that day. There's no jury. It wasn't as widely reported, that hearing, as the London trial, but it was a key turning point. Barney Rossett lost that day eventually, but he went on to appeal. And the book you have in your hands shows the success of that eventual appeal. So that's my what if. Jackie Kennedy walks into the GPO, discreetly takes a back seat and allows herself to be quietly interested in the fate of Lady Chatterley.
Well, so there are 2 trials. I mean, there's 1959, what you're talking about here, which takes place about 2 miles up from where I am. If you just walk up the street I'm on, it turns into 8th Avenue, and then you get eventually to the post office building, the grand post office building that is now partly a train station, has been retooled to be partly a train station, Penn Station across the street. Then there's the trial in London, also again, Penguin Books. And what I'm curious about, I mean, before we get into the details of that trial, it's audacious enough to write a novel in which D.H. Lawrence is, well, one of your main figures, because there are obviously a lot of other people, his wife, other friends of his, lovers are in the book. The audacity of undertaking a biographical novel or a historical novel with D.H. Lawrence at its center. But then how did you feel, what risks did you feel you were taking? What pleasures did you have? What fears did you have when you were taking Jacqueline Kennedy as a subject, a fictional, obviously a non-fictional person, but as a fictional subject? Did you feel worry on any score, or
I did eventually. I think I did. I mean, I would have been mad not to. I would have been just too brazen not to give it a thought. And I'm daring, and I believe a writer has to take risks. If you don't risk anything, you sort of lose everything. But at the same time, yes, there definitely came a point when I paused for thought. At the same time, I suppose I thought, well, in my view, in this novel, she is just a complete heroine because she championed art and literature to such a degree. So in that sense, I feel it wasn't in any way twisting her legacy, but rather imagining something that wouldn't have been improbable for her. So we don't know it happened. It probably almost certainly didn't happen. If I consulted her diary for 1959, we'd probably find she was somewhere else. She might have been. I mean, she might have been at the opening of the Lincoln Center that was opening that very day. So yes, my approach to that, Bill, is if you take a risk like that, you have to do all the work it takes. You have to do all the work and then some to be true to your subject, which is why it's been a 6-year research project, I suppose. So that meant reading all of the biographies for Jackie Kennedy's life, both little known and better known. And I love the fact that I was looking at a period, that 1959 to 1960 time in her life, with sort of flashbacks to earlier in their marriage and in their courtship. But that period when she was still a relatively anonymous figure, because, she was a junior senator's wife who then decided to throw his hat in the ring for the Democratic nomination. So frankly, if she had been Jackie K of the White House, or Jackie O of later years, I would feel swamped and almost think every perspective on her was done. But in this case, I felt, what's interesting in writing history or writing the facts is going into the little gaps that are lesser known. Those gaps fascinate me. I want to be true to the kind of fence posts on either side. I really want to be true to those, and to be more than some writers do, I suppose. Everyone takes their own stand on that. As a writer, I'm fascinated. I'm from a family of journalists. I'm fascinated by the news and by the kind of pursuit of fact. And I don't want to get in there and muck with it entirely. I want to investigate the unknown and the human complexities that lie beneath the timeline, the official timeline. So for me, I suppose when it's this, that by imagining, making calculated risks to dare to imagine human realities, with those calculated risks of imagination, one isn't being escapist. It's a place where imagination doesn't allow us to escape. It lets us go deeper. And I think that's what imaginary scenes, lovingly rendered, I hope, allow us not to escape, or not to go off into whimsy, or not to go off into, wild scenarios, but actually they take us deeper into something that might have been closer to the human truth. That's what I hope.
Well, there's what's wonderful is it is on the eve of, any time that she really becomes a totally public figure, and what, without, I don't think it's giving anything away about the novel, that the trial in London, the trial against Penguin Books, which we'll talk about now or very soon, happens at the same time as the 1960 presidential election. The election is a week after the verdict in that trial, and so the synchronicity of what's happening is provocative. And so it makes sense that Jackie Kennedy came into your mind, however accidentally or for whatever reason, and then that history at least bore out the synchronicity of these two stories that you tell.
Yes, and I suppose they both converge, don't they, Bill, around this notion of, for me, perhaps for no one else, but for me, my real preoccupation in this novel was liberal democracy, and I'm writing in that sense very much about the fragility of liberal democracy, and how it's precious. And those two historical, keystone events, the Chatterley trial, which had profound, long-lasting effects and led to the decade of free love and much more, as well as Kennedy taking the White House against every odd. I mean, there was such, I hadn't realized just what a hairline win that was. Yeah. And so for me, those were sort of two key events that led to the pinnacles of liberal democracy for the Western world. And they were both, as you say, kind of converging. And that convergence excited me. And it allowed me to show, ultimately, what I really wanted to show, I suppose, was the fragility of our liberal democracy with what was going on with Hoover's monitoring of about 1,600 senators. There were files on 1,600 senators and congressmen, particularly following their sexual preferences. And of course, we know that there is a subversives index where it's estimated between 200,000 and 10 million private American citizens were being monitored covertly in their own country. And so that, the kind of preciousness of freedom of thought. Lovely to be back, to have reconnected with human beings again. Thank you. Thank you for your patience. Yes.
Well, we were talking about the surveillance of ordinary Americans when you were cut off, so I was a little fearful that we are being surveyed at the moment, and the silence was imposed upon you. But
it was yes, I hadn't thought of that timing. All a little bit intriguing.
Yes. So J. Edgar Hoover is listening. That is the lesson of that. But one of the things, I mean, we're talking about what is happening in the autumn of 1960. I mean, both the trial in London, which, as I say, I want to discuss soon, and then also the presidential election. It reminded me of, I mean, and you bring this in the novel, certainly what kind of change the 1960 election, portends, and the shift from Eisenhower to Kennedy. I mean, and you have Eisenhower making a cameo appearance in New York at that exact moment. He happens to be doing the first shoveling of what is now Lincoln Center, which is about 30 blocks up from the post office where this trial is happening. But what struck me is I remember a line from Lady Chatterley's Lover from when I was working on my book, The World Broken Two. And there's a moment early in the novel where Lady Chatterley, Constance, is with her husband, and they are looking at the forests that they own or have owned part of, and are selling off or taking down the trees for one reason or another. And then the husband, Clifford, says something like, well, wanting to save some of it, says something like, well, we must preserve something of the old England. And then she thinks to herself, or maybe she says it aloud, even if it, is at the cost of the new England. I mean, that's not, the exact quote, but it's something like, well, do we want to preserve the old England if it's preventing the new England really from coming into being? And so it occurred to me as you were speaking that, also the promise of Kennedy's promise, campaign slogan really was a new frontier. So here we are, a new England, and Lawrence and Kennedy in very different ways representing, change. Obviously, they're completely different feats and of endeavor, but the way in which change happens, I mean, in a fragile, as you say, liberal democracy, and then also the way in which thought is controlled, and you do that so beautifully in the trial, which I want to ask you about now, the London trial, because so much of the prosecution's argument is about the thoughts of young girls and also the thoughts of the general public. Like, if this book is made available at a low cost, I think it's 3 shillings or something like that, what is going to happen to the minds of not only young people, but to the quote, hoi polloi. Like if this is just allowed to be read by anyone, then that is undoing something important, at least in the prosecution's view, about the Old England. The Old England must give way to the New England. The prosecution of Penguin Books is a way of forestalling that and saying, well, no, this is not what we're going to allow people to read. So it's very similar to what Hoover is trying to do.
Absolutely. I mean, and I found it fascinating in my research in going through those FBI files and also seeing the letters to the prosecution on this end, that not only was Hoover trying to stop Grove Press in New York for un-American activity, but he also was very happily aiding the prosecution in London to win their case and keep that book down. So he became, there are also an immense number of clippings he kept on what was happening day by day with the Chatterley case. So I mean, I wasn't there, obviously, but looking in from the outside, it seems that his obsession with that book was growing and growing. Sorry, I'm going to do this. And you're still with me? Yes, good. Sorry, earpiece. And Lawrence himself, as you're suggesting so interestingly, Bill, and I know that passage that you speak of so beautifully, going back to Lady Chatterley, when it's this sense with Clifford of the old England and the lost woodland, and there is something of an element of pathos in that, because the woodland, his native woodland, has been lost to the First World War, which you'll know so well from your brilliant book, and I loved reading. But those forests, the forests of England, especially in the north, were leveled. Many of them were leveled to build coffins and duckboards and struts. So Lady Chatterley is very much about the new order, as you suggest, and her affair that is about to unfold with the gamekeeper Oliver Mellors is very much about the new England, the new fresh life coming through, the new greenery, the new green. I mean, even novel apparently comes from the word for green shoot from a tree, which is quite beautiful. So she stands for green fertility, for the spring, the new order, and the restoration of a more natural order against this old decay in many ways. And yes, Hoover was aiding and abetting the prosecution, and the prosecution, as you said so brilliantly, were trying to continue with that unofficial sort of banning of the book. And the famous line from the 1960 trial from the barrister, which is a complete gaffe on his part, was, "Is this even a book you would wish your wife or your servants to read?" And the jury, who were from a cross range of the population, 9 men and 3 women, were, many say that's one of the lines that lost the prosecution the case, that that barrister wasn't reading the room very well. And apparently, I know from something his son wrote, that was one of almost his only improvised line in the whole of the proceedings, and he got it wrong. But that said, there are many other things going on that that pushed the book over the edge to victory. But it was, more than I ever realized, such a hard-won trial. So it was such a coup, because the prosecution tactics were I don't want to say dirty, I don't want to say underhand. They were complacent in their research around the book, their preparation around the book was arrogant. They thought, of course, they're going to win the day. They are on the side of power that always wins the day. The defense worked their socks off to amass an incredible range of expert witnesses. The prosecution, in the end, couldn't muster a single expert witness. When they realized that, they then went into battle stations. And the strategies which are discussed in their memos of the time, were if you cannot discredit the book, so first of all, they're going to try to discredit the book, and whole lists of rude words, of the obscenities, were read out in court in this very proper Edwardian courtroom, the Old Bailey, to shock the jury. just lists of, and the counts. I'm not going to repeat them here, but the counts of the words. And that was one strategy. The next strategy was, if you can't discredit the book, discredit the witnesses. And so they really began to do some minor humiliations on the expert witnesses coming up. Sometimes they succeeded, sometimes not. And then the final strategy, in a way, was the most subtle, if you like, and that was to discredit Lady Chatterley, as if her and her sexuality were actually on trial, to paint her as what the prosecution called a sex-starved girl, and to diminish her and to say, that's really all we're looking at here, ladies and gentlemen. There's nothing here to see. We're looking at, the defense later paraphrased them and said, that the prosecution is trying to paint her as a nymphomaniac, and she is anything but. She is seeking human connection, emotional fulfillment in a sexual relationship. So that it was startlingly candid testimony unfolding over 6 days at the Old Bailey. And Lawrence, in a sense, was of course on trial. One of the lead barristers for the defense actually said that he had visions of him, of Lawrence standing there in what we call the dock here, standing there in the box on trial himself. And Lawrence had always envisaged this book as a bomb of a book. So he wrote to his publisher. He said, the novel is fattening. It's a little bomb of a book. And he spoke of a lot of his work that way, about laying mines under the old status quo to burst through, explode through into something new.
I mean, you do feel about in the trial, of course, I mean, in any censorship trial, or that the author is on trial, although the author is not ever really a party to this. I mean, it so happens that in 1922, in my book,
Yes.
part of what happens is there's a censorship trial in New York about women in love in the summer of 1922, and it's an important trial from a legal point of view, because it's the first censorship trial in which literary experts are allowed to testify, and their testimony has to be taken into account. There have been trials before that where literary experts have tried to make the case, but the judge ruled that they can, their opinions can be taken. And also what one of the in the conclusion of your trial, I guess, before it goes to the jury, is a warning. You can't just take one passage and say that, it's because of this passage. That was also the case in that 1922 trial.
How interesting. Well, I think in Britain, the obscenity law was revised a bit later to allow for both those features you just described. Only about 6 months, in 1959. So it was late, but that doesn't surprise me. In the UK, it was a bit late coming in.
I mean, so what's interesting to me about this trial is that Lawrence, who has now been dead 30 years, is on trial, and it's as if hoisting him by his own words. I mean, when the prosecution reads those passages that you've alluded to, that we're not going to read now, but it's as if, well, this is the most damning thing. I mean, we're just going to read what he wrote, and in some way, saying it aloud seems to shock everyone, including the defense. They feel that this is, oh my God, they're going
we're
to
done for
this way, and so the knife edge of the 1960 election, and the fear in the courtroom, or outside the courtroom, that their side has lost. And what's so interesting is that, of course, as I say, the author is on trial, and yet that's not who's on trial. It's the publisher. It's the editor. I mean,
yes. And I hadn't realized that. I mean, of course, I knew Lawrence was 30 years dead by the time the London trial happened. I knew that. I had, as I said a few moments ago, assumed that, well, it's 1960. Of course, the book is going to win. There was no, of course, about it. That's digging behind the scenes through the archives of both the defense and the prosecution. The knife edge became really apparent, and Sir Alan Lane, the publisher of Penguin Books, I think it's little known. No one here in Literary London that I've ever spoken to has realised, apart from perhaps his daughter, who was actually attending that at that time, attending the trial as an 18-year-old, I believe she was 18, that they risked their father going to prison. That's because there was either a steep and unlimited fine that would be set by the judge, and the judge, as the trial unfolded, it became more than obvious. I mean, the bits in my book are taken from the transcript. He is completely biased in favor of the prosecution. He's completely against the sort of promiscuous material of Lady Chatterley, and he intervenes quite often, as does his wife, who in a very bizarre, well, her presence intervenes. She's glowering, according to all reports, down because she was allowed to sit next to her husband, the judge, up on the judge's stand. So that's all very, very strange. But Sir Alan Lane also faced potentially a prison of 3 years if found guilty, if Penguin Books was found guilty. No one knew exactly, because it was testing new aspects of the law. It was a test case. No one knew if he'd be fined, the organisation would be fined, or if he'd be sent down the stairs below the Old Bailey, taken down, as they say, into the cells. So it was really a pivotal moment, and the prosecution were clever, and they set him up quite effectively as he was giving evidence.
It's so beautifully done. I mean, your book is so beautifully written throughout. I mean, of course, we know that a lot of it is fictionalized. I mean, and so it's beautifully imagined. It's beautifully executed. We haven't even gotten into the complexities of the storylines and the way they come in, and the way the past comes into the present, and the way the present reflects the past, and the way you do that with characters appearing and their letters, etc. I mean, there's just so many different registers that you work in, and that all come together so beautifully. But that trial is narrated so magnificently, and of course, I mean, anyone who is reading the book likely knows that Lady Chatterley's Lover was allowed to be published by Penguin Books. I mean, it's not.
It's not a secret. No.
I mean, we know John Kennedy was elected president.
We know he got through, exactly.
And yet, we're still very anxious. And hearing that trial, and you quote transcripts, and they're just there, but it's very dramatically done. I mean, it's almost, it's really nail biting and woven together, as I say, so beautifully. Even though these are short transcripts, and you wouldn't think they have the drama that you are able to give to them.
Yeah, and that was the great discovery. I was on the edge of my seat in the archives, just seeing what was going on behind the scenes, and how that fed through into the in-court performances of all concerned, and just what had mounted before the first day of the trial, the pitch that things had reached even before the trial began. I was moved by it. I was on the edge of my seat. And then, yes, I think the actual transcript is perhaps of the trial is, I don't know, I'm reaching here, but 800 to 900 pages. Right. And so to distill, so I spent a long time just distilling. And then, of course, just in the interest of wanting to look after my readers through the trial, of weaving my narration, being narrator, and almost inviting the reader to come into that courtroom, to stand at the threshold with the narrator, and to watch it unfold almost as a piece of theatre, which is very much how it was performed. I mean, it was this, the Old Bailey, a trial in 1960 unfolding in court number 1 at the Old Bailey, was a massive ritual and piece of theatre, both.
One of the things, I won't give away anything about who the character from Lawrence's past who returns, but was that woman actually at the trial? I mean, or is that a fictional device?
Well, I'm going to take liberties and just stretch what exactly that beautiful point you made. There was a young female student who was from Lawrence's past, from a previous important period of his life, that everyone thinks, oh, that was such a lovely coincidence. Does the character Dina, did you put her there. No, I didn't. She was one of the pivotal witnesses, and it was a joy for me to discover. Again, I was so excited because that's not really been picked up on before, that a family that Lawrence betrayed, in a sense, on the page by using them and all the details of their life in a story, England, My England, that very family produces one of the three key witnesses who's about, in 1960, 45 years later, the granddaughter of that house will save his book, will be one of three key witnesses. And she's the final witness of that trial. So she was actually there. The other woman that you're referring to, and I don't mind saying who it was Rosalind Thornycroft Baines, who was the woman that Lawrence actually had his one extramarital love affair of life. So Frida Lawrence, it's commonly known, had many affairs, and that was a part of their ethos, their shared ethos, that sexual appetite should not be curbed. And yet Lawrence seethed and raged and was humiliated by it. And it was a very complex thing. They functioned differently. She spoke about D.H. Lawrence's soul mush when he was in love, that he sort of was in love with mystery in a potential partner and in a woman he might have his head turned by. She said he sees them as Gothic cathedrals, then realizes they're little houses. So that was Frida talking about Lawrence in love. He had his one affair of life with Rosalind Thornycroft Baines in Italy, 1920, and I was very much reminded of that period because when 1922, the time of your book, Bill, he's going through and revising those poems and still adding new poems to the collection that began, inspired by Rosalind, the erotic poems of Sangiovese. So if we flash forward many years, he leaves her. That's a 3-week affair. It's been life-defining. And she, in many ways, becomes the model for Lady Chatterley. It's her physical appearance. It's her biography. It's many aspects. And her sexual charge, I would say, is there with Lady Chatterley. Flash forward to the trial. I don't want to disappoint, but she was in London at that time. So again, she was well connected to so many of the people in that courtroom. I haven't pinned down her, say, step-granddaughter, who's a friend, to say, well, she wasn't she. Perhaps I wanted it to be left as an unknown for me. But she was about 73, 74. She lived very close to the Old Bailey. She knew many of the people involved. Those tickets were just like going like hotcakes. You couldn't get a ticket for the Lady Chatterley trial. They're little pink ticket stubs. I've seen them in the archive, and everyone was trying to get a ticket. The courtroom only held about 200 people in total. So there was the ticketed people on the floor, the unticketed people in the public gallery upstairs, all crammed in. And I don't know that she was there, but again, I think I would have been there. Had it been me, I would have been there. That's an element of my story in Lady Chatterley, and he had been my lover once upon a time, I would have found my way into that trial. But that's me.
No, that was beautifully done. Well, we have time. We have an audience question. Thank you so much for this. I want to talk to you for another 2 hours. We haven't gotten nearly deeply enough into what's going on in your book, but it is.
Oh, you've done a brilliant job, Bill. I mean, I'm just distilling it, so thank you.
Oh, well, thank you for having written it. I'm really glad to have read it. And I love the paradox of Lawrence, the title Tenderness, because he could be so brutal. And you allude to that in the way he used that family in England, My England. And he did that with so many people in his life, and was often so cruel to them in the pages of Adeline Morrill in Women in Love. And
or Jesse Chambers and Sons and Lovers, and countless people.
How used people felt, and then how in a certain way over time they seemed to accept that they had been useful for his literary genius and to somehow, come to terms with it. Many people seem to have been able to do that.
Many seem, yes, and I would think it's still in with that particular family today. I think the acceptance is there for some, and for others, it's down the generations. It's still a wound. It's interesting, and I understand that as well.
So that's how Tenderness becomes a present day story too, in many ways. And let's get to the question, because we don't have much time left. I think I know the answer, but let's have you answer. The audience question is: Did you, Alison, have to get privilege, to use Jackie Kennedy as a fictional character?
As you know the answer on this, Bill. No, I didn't. Because there's sort of no element of slander or libel. As I say, she's quite a heroine for me, she is the heroine of the novel. But also because she's now deceased, no permission was required. I mean, we did look through very much, I suppose, what I did do, because I'm still aware of family, and I wanted to treat that as respectfully as I could. So I did make a little. I would never twist a scene or misrepresent out of concern of what a family would say, because my responsibilities have to be bigger than that. And yet there are a couple of lines I thought, actually, I will shave a little bit away, just in case. I suppose it was silly of me, absurd, to even think that Caroline Kennedy might pick this up or might know of it. But I just was aware of that and wanted to be a bit sensitive to that. So that was my compromise.
So the other question from the audience, and it was something I was going to bring up, and we have a few minutes to answer it. I'm not sure which book this is referring to. There is an article in our Charleston paper today about our governor demanding a ban of a book from school libraries. I presume that this is Beloved by Toni Morrison, which is obviously the run-up to this election. So not only in 1960 but now. And it was almost like Toni Morrison and Beloved were on the ballot somehow, not only on trial but on the ballot. So could you say something about present day efforts to control the thoughts of what people, by controlling what people read, and what kind of risk that poses? We know what's going on in the United States. Is this also an issue in the UK, which you might be familiar with?
I've seen that case about Beloved, and given that, for me, it's one of perhaps the greatest novel, or one of the greatest novels of the 20th century. I was shocked and horrified, I'll be honest. That my concern is that whether in the UK, probably there's nothing that blatant going on at the moment. There are other issues about, let's say, hurtful speech, hateful speech, and of course, where we draw the line at suppressing and stopping and censoring. It's a fraught question here. It's a fraught question, and yet there's nothing as explicit that I know of right now going on as there is around Beloved. Mm-hmm. And for me, that we say freedom of speech, we say, of course, it's about freedom, it's about having a voice, and all of us being entitled to have a voice within a democracy. Democracy functions on nothing else but a dialogue of voices. If we say your voice is allowed, we all know that argument. Freedom of speech is a familiar phrase for me. I always think of it, take it in my own mind a little bit further, to think of freedom of the imagination, that the imagination has to be unfettered. The imagination has to be able to imagine, document the whole of human experience. And without that, we begin diminishing the great organ of the human mind from which all curiosity about others stems, which is the human imagination. And it's that very imagination that allows us potentially to imagine better futures. If we can't imagine it, we can't get to the better future. So, and it's what allows empathy between human beings. And literature for me, that going back to Tenderness where we began, if it's about anything, it's about empathy and sympathy between human beings who are other than we are, who are different on the outside than we are. So when we begin to chip away at freedom of voice, freedom of the imagination, we're chipping away at the very ability to understand the others, so-called others, with whom we share the planet, society, our neighborhood, everything else. And that's when forces like FBI under Hoover and that ideology of so-called American purity, or even I'll say America first, that kind of thinking we are this one thing, this is who we are, that frightens me.
Well, thank you. I mean, we'll end there. I mean, because we are ending your description of what is achieved through the unfettered imagination is also where we began, the what ifs that led you to write this book.
Yeah.
And so thank you, Alison MacLeod. We have I enjoyed this so much, and look forward to meeting you in person at some point. I really hope I get.
I'd love to meet you. It's been a privilege to be in conversation with you. But having read this remarkable book, it's been an absolute privilege to be in conversation with you. Really, I feel like our books are sort of wanting to meet as well. They have.
Mutual Admiration Society. But
yeah,
thank you
absolutely.
so much. And
thank you, Bill.
As I say, thank you to Charleston also, and
yes, and to Diana.
And
thank you.
We will meet again, I hope.
We will. I feel sure of it, Bill. And thank you to the audience for coming today or for listening. It means such a lot to know that it's telepathic. Books go out into the world, you write them in your little room, and you connect with minds across space. And I find that so moving and hopeful.